We're beginning now in Genesis chapter 16, which says, Now Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children, and she had an Egyptian maid whose name was Hagar. So Sarai said to Abram, Now behold, the Lord has prevented me from bearing children. Please go in to my maid, perhaps I will obtain children through her. And Abram listened to the voice of Sarai. After Abram had lived 10 years in the land of Canaan, Abram's wife, Sarai, took Hagar, the Egyptian her maid, and gave her to her husband Abram as his wife. He went in to Hagar, and she conceived, and when she saw that she had conceived, her mistress was despised in her sight. And Sarai said to Abram, May the wrong done me be upon you. I gave my maid into your arms. But when she saw that she had conceived, I was despised in her sight. May the Lord judge between you and me. But Abram said to Sarai, Behold, your maid is in your power. Do to her what is good in your sight. So Sarai treated her harshly, and she fled from her presence. Let's comment on this part before we go any further. One thing that we see from the very beginning here is that this maid, Hagar, is actually an Egyptian. So this is someone that Abram and Sarah would have picked up during their travels down into Egypt. So if you think that what follows is distasteful, or you think what follows involved some sin, and of course it did involve some bad choices on everyone's part, I think, then you can point this back to the journey to Egypt, which we have already discussed is probably a misstep on Abram's part. And so this is a testimony to the far-reaching impacts that sin has. Even after someone goes back to their former altar, as it were, even after someone repents and gets right with God, sometimes they still have to experience the earthly manifestations of the problems that they're created for themselves. You know, I think sometimes we'll see some preacher fall into some immorality or something, and they will repent, and they'll repent publicly, and then they are surprised why people don't immediately forgive them. Or if they're not surprised, some of their followers are surprised and will say things like, "Well, hey, listen, you know, this guy did the biblical thing. He repented. He got right with God. He made it right. Shouldn't he be installed back into perfect fellowship and there be no problems?" Well, you know, the truth is that repentance and getting things right with God is vital in such situations, and you have to do that. However, the damage that's been done to your reputation in people's eyes, the damage that's been done to you in the community is sometimes long-lasting. You know, sometimes people experience the ramifications of their sexual sin for the rest of their lives. You know, they get some sexually transmitted disease. People that are involved with drug addiction, they have to experience the bad physical things that have happened because of that for the rest of their lives. And they may even have the addiction for their whole lives. There may be people who think, well, if I become a Christian and I'll try to give up this thing, maybe that will resolve the addiction. Maybe God will miraculously deliver me from this. And sometimes that does happen. That certainly can happen. God can do that. However, He doesn't always do that. And those ingrained habits and those things that you experience that you did to yourself are things that you have to live with forever, at least for the rest of your human existence. And so we see here in this story that when they went down to Egypt, they must have picked up Hagar there, and that what follows would probably not have happened if that had not been the case. Now, you might say, well, now hold on a second. What about Ishmael? Doesn't God value Ishmael's life? What about the peoples that came out of Ishmael? Doesn't God value them? I think He does. And so we'll talk more specifically about that when we get there. All I really want to focus on now is just to make the point that if they had stayed in the land and gone through the land building altars, but not gone down into Egypt, this would likely never have happened. And so we can see the ramifications of our sins. Now, the smart thing to say about this, I think, is that God can use our mistakes. And He can take the bad situations that we create for ourselves and He can bring something beautiful out of that situation. But that doesn't mean that He was in favor of the sin that led to that situation. And that is vitally important. Just because something turns out good in the end, the ends do not justify the means. God can redeem a situation, and He's sovereign over the circumstances, but that doesn't mean He made the thing to happen that happened. And so He didn't cause the bad thing to happen. I don't think He wants the bad thing to happen, the sinful thing, but He can bring something beautiful out of that. And that's an important thing to remember as we begin here in looking at this story. But actually, before that, it tells us that Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children. Now, one thing that we have to remember in setting up for what will follow is that in chapter 15, we learned God told Abram directly that this Eliezer of Damascus, who Abram was planning to leave everything, all of his inheritance with Eliezer, and that would in effect be his son. And he was trying to sort of resolve this problem on God's behalf. God says that's absolutely not the way it's going to work. He says, this man will not be your heir, in verse 4 of chapter 15, but one who will come forth from your own body. He shall be your heir. Now, notice something here that I think a lot of preachers miss when they're preaching on this text, and that is that God had told Abram that Abram would have a biological son, but He did not say specifically who the mother of that child would be. Now, without being too graphic, men can have children at a much older age, so to speak, than women can. Men can father children much later in life, whereas women at a certain point can no longer do that. And Sarai is at that point now. I mean, I think it's 75 years old, something like that, where she is now. She's certainly past the age where we would typically think about a woman having children. And here Abram is. He's heard this promise, but nothing's happened yet, and he's still standing by wondering. And so he's thinking, okay, well, now what do I need to do about this? Okay, God told me, let me put the pieces of the puzzle together. Okay, God told me that I'm supposed to have a biological offspring. How's that going to work? Well, He didn't tell me necessarily that Sarai is going to be the mother of that child, and nothing's really happening yet, so what am I supposed to do about this? And it's actually Sarai's idea, or at least she's the one that brings it up. Because she says, so Sarai said to Abram, now behold, the Lord has prevented me from bearing children. Please go into my maid, perhaps I will obtain children through her. And Abram listened to the voice of Sarai. You know, it has been true since the dawn of time that a woman has the ear of her husband. We know that Eve, in the case of eating of the fruit of the tree, she was able to influence her husband to follow her in that sinful activity of rebellion against God. You know, we think today, well, you know, back in that day, women were something like chattel, unfortunately, and men didn't necessarily respect their wives to the degree that we in the 21st century in the Western world think that a man ought to respect and honor his wife. And so they didn't necessarily listen, and women didn't have the influence. That's not true. It is true that men back then didn't respect or hold women in the same position necessarily that we do today. Women had different roles, and they were aware of those roles. However, what this story tells us, what the story in the garden tells us, is that women did have a powerful influence over the men in their lives. And this suggestion was made. Now, women can use that influence for good or for evil. And so there is a little bit of responsibility on the woman here. If you're a wife in a relationship, you have a responsibility, I think, in this regard because of who you are, because of your physical beauty, because of your close proximity to your husband, because you're the voice that he probably hears more than any other voice in his daily life. And by the way, even if you all don't talk that much, the average couple doesn't talk nearly enough. However, there is a lot more said through body language than there is through verbal language. And so just being in the same household with a man, you have a strong influence over him. We just had a student at Trinity College of the Bible and Theological Seminary just yesterday send in a video testimony of his experience at Trinity. He was talking about what a blessing Trinity was in his life. And in the midst of watching that video, and he's kind of telling what he called his Trinity story, he talked about how he had taken some courses at Trinity, and it had been a blessing. He said it was like drinking out of a fire hydrant. It was just great stuff. However, life happened and ministry-related issues happened, and then he got to the place where he wasn't able to continue his studies as he had done. And one night, after about a year or so, I don't remember what he said, of not continuing his studies, his wife, lying in bed, his wife said, "You really need to get back to this. You really need to, I just really think you need to start again at Trinity." And he said, it was just as though God had told me that. And that really stuck out to me because it is the antithesis of what we see here. A woman can use that special power she has over her husband for good or for evil. In this case, I think it was for good. Because as a man, I can tell you that sometimes you are hindered from making certain decisions because you worry about what your wife will think about that decision. You worry whether she'll be on board with that because it may involve a move. It may involve more time away from her or away from the family or whatever. And for a woman to say something like that, "Hey, listen, I think you ought to go back to seminary." What a liberating answer to prayer that is, and sort of a confirmation that it's the right time. So there can be a good or a bad use of this special influence that I do think it's true that women have over their husbands in this regard. And so it says, "And Abram listened to the voice of Sarai." After Abram had lived 10 years in the land of Canaan, Abram's wife, Sarai, took Hagar, the Egyptian, her maid, and gave her to her husband Abram as his wife. Now, you might be wondering, how is this actually supposed to work? I mean, this looks like polygamy. And it is, in a manner of speaking, and we're not endorsing this here. This is actually Abram and Sarai trying to manufacture a ministry or God's will in their lives. God did not tell them to do this. They did this on their own. Now, I think we're often too hard on Abram and Sarai at this point. Now, in a few moments, something happens in the story where I think we can be hard on the characters. However, at this point in the story, I don't think we want to be too hard on them. You might say, well, how in the world can you say such a thing? Of course, what they did here was horribly wicked. I mean, polygamy is just the worst imaginable thing. And when you add to it that it wasn't really just polygamy, but you had this slave, basically, in Hagar, who becomes a concubine. A concubine is like a slave wife for Abram, and just treating her like property. How can this ever be defended? Well, we think about it sometimes from our 21st century vantage point when we need to try and understand the culture of the time and how that cultural perspective informs what we're reading here, because it absolutely informs it. It is the case, and we know this from the Code of Hammurabi, we know this from other ancient sources, that there was a practice at the time. I mean, at that time, they didn't have all of these sorts of bizarre, Frankenstein sort of ways of trying to make a woman fertile that we have today. And if that offends you, I'm sorry. But frankly, I'll just tell you as a side note, while I think that some of the fertility practices that we have today that can help people medically might be permissible and might be helpful, I'm not against modern medicine or the advances from modern medicine. Some of the things that we do now actually lead to indirectly to abortion, which I think is one of the most wicked and disgusting practices that we have in the modern day. And we think we're so enlightened in what we have now. And sometimes what we call enlightened leads to some of the most barbaric things that previous generations of Americans would look at and be disgusted by and possibly be sick to their stomach about. But I think some of these fertility practices are problematic. But whatever you think about that, they didn't have those sorts of things back then. And so what would you do? Well, one thing that you would do is you would, if a woman was barren and couldn't have children, then either another wife was taken, or a handmaiden, a concubine was made. You took your maid and you offered that. And in the case of a handmaiden specifically, if it was another wife, well, then that child would belong to that man and that wife. We see this in the story of Rachel and Leah later on. But in the case of Rachel and Leah, both Rachel and Leah had their own handmaidens like this, had their own maids who would also serve to have more pregnancies, more births. And while in the case of two noble women, we might say, who are on equal footing, more or less, their children would be their children. But in the case of a handmaiden, that child would be birthed in such a way that it would become the child that would, in every way that matters, belong to the woman who the handmaiden was serving, the mistress whom the handmaiden was serving. So that woman, that child would be her child, in effect. And this was just the way that it was. This was the culture. How else would a person produce a child? And as far as they were concerned, at this point in the early history of man, we're still in somewhat of an early history of man. The primary goal is to produce offspring. I mean, even in this covenant that has happened in the previous chapter, the goal, the promise, everything really centers around offspring. And so the production, I don't want to be mechanical about it, but the production of offspring is really what is in view here. And so if you know that your command is to have children, and you're married to someone, and you all can't produce children for whatever biological reason, your natural thought, now whether we think this is a good thought or a beneficial thought or a righteous thought, your natural thought would be, well, then we better get another woman in here and start having children that way, because our principal goal is to be having children. Now that leads you to the question, and you say, okay, well, I understand that that's a cultural thing, that was a cultural construct. And so from that perspective, whether or not it is sin remains to be seen, but we can say at least that it was understandable in the day, in that time. But then you still have to ask the question, but is that what God wanted? Was that sin or not? Now, most typically the way that this would be answered is to say, well, the fact is that God never was really pleased about polygamy. He tolerated, this is how I've always heard it preached in my lifetime, that he tolerated polygamy because there was a limited light of Scripture. That they didn't have scriptural documents like we have today to consult and to see what God wanted and what God didn't want. Of course, the whole purpose of what we're discussing right now is that we do have those things, and we're still having to ask the question. But the point is, there was limited light of Scripture, and so God winced at what they did. God tolerated things that were sinful, and polygamy would have always been sinful. It was always the wrong thing. However, God tolerated it in light of the fact that they didn't have clear, special revelation about this. Of course, the thing that always struck me about that, and that may well be the case, the thing that always struck me about that is that God did speak to people. God did speak clearly, and one of the things he seems most interested in talking about to early peoples is about child production and childbearing and offspring and populating the earth and all this sort of thing. So if that's merely the thing, that there just wasn't enough revelation, and if they only had more of what God wanted to say, well, then they would know that polygamy was wrong. What's always struck me about that is he's talking to them about this very subject all the time, and we don't have a record of him making it abundantly clear and specifically clear. You would think that he would. So, well, then are you saying that you think it was okay? Well, no, I personally think that it is not the best thing. I would have major reservations about someone trying to practice polygamy today. But we still have to ask the question. We still have to consider this. Now, one of my favorite Bible teachers, in fact, one of the men who is listed on the page where I kind of give praise to several different Bible teachers. I won't mention who it is because he usually has an answer for everything. And I specifically wrote to him and asked him his thoughts on this, on a particular aspect of this. Now, he sent me back a pre-written answer to the question of polygamy, which was basically what I've already just said. It was not what God wanted. God made them male and female. As Jesus later says, that the original pattern was a man and a woman, one man and one woman who would live together monogamously for the rest of their lives. And all of that may be true. That is the ideal. But I asked him a very specific question that I don't think I got a real clear answer to. That's why I'm not going to tell you who he is. I don't want to disparage him with this. But I asked him about a very interesting law that is found in the book of Deuteronomy and how it might bear on this. Now, if this is not interesting to you, I think it's pretty interesting because I've never really heard anyone address this question. If you'll go to Deuteronomy chapter 25 and verse 5, Deuteronomy chapter 25 and verse 5, we have here what is referred to as the Levirate law, the Levirate law. And here's what it says. When brothers live together, and one of them dies and has no son, the wife of the deceased shall not be married outside the family to a strange man. Her husband's brother shall go in to her and take her to himself as wife, and perform the duty of a husband's brother to her. It shall be that the firstborn whom she bears shall assume the name of his dead brother, so that his name will not be blotted out from Israel. But if the man does not desire to take his brother's wife, then his brother's wife shall go up to the gate to the elders and say, My husband's brother refuses to establish a name for his brother in Israel. He is not willing to perform the duty of a husband's brother to me. Then the elders of his city shall summon him and speak to him. And if he persists and says, I do not desire to take her, then his brother's wife shall come to him in the sight of the elders and pull his sandal. Now listen to this strange ceremony that has to take place. And pull his sandal off his foot and spit in his face, and she shall declare, Thus it is done to the man who does not build up his brother's house. In Israel his name shall be called the house of him whose sandal is removed. Okay, so what is supposed to happen is, this is the Levirate law, that's what it's called, the Levirate law. And the idea is, it's not called that anywhere in Scripture. That's just what it has, I think that's a Latin phrase that has been applied to it. But the thinking is, if a woman is, and this has to do with protecting property distribution in Israel and making sure also about, like it flatly says there, the name of the brother will not be blotted out. All these things have to be kept in order, and it's a very delicate thing. And so if a woman has no children with a man and the husband dies, then the brother of that man is required to marry her. And now he has a way out, but it's a very shameful way out. And this is a shame culture. It is honor shame culture. You do not want to bring shame. It's kind of like Asian cultures today, where there's an honor shame element. You don't want to bring shame on your peoples. And so what is required to happen by law is, if he will not marry her, maybe he thinks she's unattractive, maybe he's got some other distasteful thing about it, she is supposed to go to the leaders, and then they're supposed to perform this strange ceremony where she takes off his sandal in everybody's public, and then she's supposed to spit, and she's supposed to say, Thus it shall be to the man who will not take care of his brother's wife, and his house will be named that way. And thus it shall be, that's unclear, but most scholars think that thus it shall be, when that is said, there's supposed to be some sort of visible indication, that like have you ever seen someone take their index finger and run it across their throat, like I'll slit your throat, that kind of thing? Thus it shall be. Someone might say something like that, do some motion like that while they're saying it. It's a very shameful thing. Now it can sometimes be carried out tastefully. We see that in the book of Ruth. We see that ceremony actually carried out, the sandal thing. And it's carried out tastefully there because all parties involved are favorable to what is happening. Nevertheless, why do I bring all this weird stuff up about the Levirate law? The reason that I bring it all up is because it occurred to me in studying that on one occasion that would mean that it could be an indirect mandate for polygamy from God. Even though we all want to say, well, God didn't want this, but he tolerated it. Well, and that people say he never commanded polygamy, and that sort of thing. Well, I'm not so sure, because if the Levirate law is carried out, most young men would marry. And if they were married and then their brother was married and their brother died, they're now required, at the threat of shame in the community, to take his wife. Well, if you've already got a wife, then you take your brother's wife. Well, now you're a polygamist, but yet you're carrying out what the law is according to God. That has troubled me a little bit, and I never could find anything much about it searching, even on the internet, but certainly not in the commentaries. I did find where John MacArthur had responded to a question about this, and what he said was that this clearly means that the brother who is supposed to take the wife was not currently married, because otherwise it would amount to a mandate of polygamy, just like I had thought. But of course, that's just to beg the question. That's what we're trying to figure out. Is that what he's supposed to do? So you'll have to make up that decision on your own. I only bring it up now just by way of mentioning that despite what we say, at the very least, given all of this, even now, it might be difficult to come up with a clear and obvious answer to this question about Sarai and Hagar and Abraham and all that went on there. But certainly in their day, it was very unclear, and I'm sure they thought this is just the way that this is the way you do things. This is the way it's supposed to be done. So I just don't think we can be too hard on them for this. If you disagree with me, you can write to me and tell me how wrong I am about that. But I look forward to hearing your disgruntled email on this question. So let's see what happens next. He went into Hagar, and she conceived, and when she saw that she had conceived, her mistress was despised in her sight. Now, what that means is that she didn't act right towards Sarai. She acted objectionably towards Sarai. Now, what we might say about that is, well, she got proud about it. She got haughty about it. Now this is where we can start to make some judgment calls regarding both Sarai and Hagar, because they both do something wrong here. In Hagar's case, she's acting inappropriately towards Sarai. Now, we can see this because at that point, now I don't want to be crass, but at that point in history, in general, the way a woman found value in herself was largely in how many children she could produce. So you remember Hannah and Samuel and all of that sort of thing, and how she found herself there praying at the tabernacle, and obviously praying, just moving her lips and whispering her prayers, I suppose. And the priest thought she was drunk because of this. Well, all of that tells you how important this was. On top of that, you consider Rachel and Leah again, and the competition that was there. I mean, talk about desperate housewives. I mean, there it was in Technicolor. And so a woman's value was found in how many children she could produce. So here we can see that if Hagar is now able to produce a child where Sarai could not, then we see here now this value disparity in the eyes of the people, the human people involved. By the way, I should say before we comment more on this, what about the sexual immorality that we might consider to be going on here? Again, I just think you need to consider this to be cultural. Do I think it's sinful for a man to have a sexual liaison with someone who he's not married to? Well, that just loops us back into the previous discussion of whether or not they were married and how God views all of that. But here's what I do think. I do think that if the point of this was sexual gratification, then we would have even more reason to be to question Abram's morality at this point. But I'm sure Abram was sexually attracted to Hagar, although I've told my wife before, I've thought, Hagar does not sound like a very attractive woman just going by the name, what's in a name, but still, I mean, Hagar, I don't think of a very attractive looking woman when I think of the name Hagar. So forgive me if you're out there in internet land and your name is Hagar. Forgive me for that. But I'm sure he was sexually attracted to her. I mean, he's a man with clearly a healthy sexual functioning reproductive system and all of that. But the point is, that wasn't the point of this whole thing. Nevertheless, the reason I thought to mention this now is there is a bond that can be created in that sort of a union. And I'm sure that Hagar is starting to feel a little bit connected to Abram, and we don't know really what Abram's thinking about this, but now there is this, Hagar's probably thinking, hey, here I am, I've got some kind of claim on this family now that I didn't have before, and things have kind of gone in my favor, things have changed here, And this is a kind of weird and bizarre situation, but hey, I'm going to go with this, and I'm feeling pretty good about myself. So we can cast some blame here on Hagar's attitude, at least at this point. And verse 5 says, Sarai said to Abram, "May the wrong done me be upon you. I gave my maid into your arms, but when she saw that she had conceived, I was despised in her sight. May the Lord judge between you and me." But Abram said to Sarai, "Behold, your maid is in your power. Do to her what is good in your sight." So Sarai treated her harshly, and she fled from her presence. So now we see the other two characters doing something wrong here too. Abram, because he's being a little bit of a poor head of household here. I mean, think about it. This guy is supposed to be sort of, as in our culture even today, most conservative Christians would say that the man should in some sense take a leadership role in the family. Certainly back then, and here now he sees that these women have got a problem with each other, and again, desperate housewives here. And so what am I supposed to do about this? So Sarai comes and says, "Hey, you got to do something about this. This is not good." And so Abram, instead of taking that leadership role and sort of facilitating some kind of a solution in this situation that they have created for themselves, instead of doing that, what does Abraham do? He says, I'm not getting involved in this. You do this, whatever you want to do, that's fine with me. And unfortunately, that is a problem that we still have even in the church today. Men who will not become involved and instead force the wives in the family, the wife in the family, to be put into a role that, and you may be upset with my saying this, but I don't think is the ideal role. I think the ideal role is that the man obviously talk with and submit. They should submit one to each other is the New Testament principle, but ultimately someone's got to have the final say. And I think that in a situation like this, where the wife says, "Hey, I need you to do something about this situation," that a man should do something about it. A man should be the head of his household in that respect. And Abram did not do this. He wimped out of this. He chickened out of this. And in our world today, oftentimes, I used to pastor a church in McMinnville, Tennessee, and people are going to hear this from there, and they're not going to appreciate what I have to say about this, but it's not too big of a deal. But I was so thrilled when I went to pastor that church at age 22. I mean, it's hard to imagine this church. They had about 220 in regular worship attendance. When I was 22 years old, I went there, and they had a great sanctuary. I mean, it was more than adequate. But everything was pink. I mean, everything in that sanctuary was pink. And as you walked up and down the hallways, the different Sunday school classrooms were decorated, all of them with like floral, paintings and wall hangings, and everything was just as girly as it could possibly be. And we are living in a day and age where that is what the common outsider, who is a man, thinks has come to think about the church. These is just this is a mamby-pamby sort of thing. Real men don't need religion. Real men can handle their own problems. They don't need some Santa Claus figure in the sky handling their problems for them. That stuff is for women and children. And so we have men who will send their wives to church, and those wives will take the children to church, and the wives make all of the spiritual decisions and all the major decisions really that matter in life about church and about God and about all these things. And as a result, it's not the fault of the women. As a result, now because women have had to take the leadership roles in a lot of cases, and we see it reflected in the church. And so everything's pink and everything's floral. And it's, I'm just saying I'm not criticizing it because you're the ones who are doing this stuff, but it creates an atmosphere that is a little bit more feminine. And it is really a testimony to the fact that we live in a day and age where even the men who are Christian men, it's not just true of families where the men aren't taking a leadership role because they are not Christians, but even in Christian families, it is often the case that the real dominantly spiritually invested, biblically minded person, if there is one in the family, is the woman, and the man is a little bit disinterested. I always find it incredibly refreshing when I go to a church and I meet a man who loves the Bible and loves to study the Bible. I mean, to me, what more manly way to spend your time, you know? And I find a man who invests himself in the Word of God and in the ministry of the church, and wants to help out in the church in any way that he can. And I'm not just talking about someone who becomes a professional minister. I'm talking about someone who is a leader in his family and is also available to lead in some way in church. There's someone very close to me in my own family, on my wife's side of the family, who I believe, if he was a church-going man, it's not my position to know whether or not he's a Christian, but if he were a church-going man, I know his type. I know what he would do. He would be the kind of man who he may never reach the level of spiritual depth that some other men would, but he would be the man who would notice that the gutter is hanging loose on the outside of the building and go fix it without being asked. He would be the one who would notice other things that need repair and be a good advisor in terms of decision-making that has to do with the property and what's going on in the community with respect to how they view the church and those sorts of things. I just think that a spiritually minded man is a blessing in his home as a leader and in the church as a leader. And we have far too few men like that in the church today. And they leave it to their wives to make all the decisions. And I believe that this is an unbiblical thing, and it's not fair to those wives. So Abram messes up here. And it's not just Abram that messes up. Abram messes up, Sarai messes up, and Hagar messes up. Sarai messes up because she treats Hagar wrongly. Because once Abram says to her in verse 6, it says, "But Abram said to Sarai, Behold, your maid is in your power. Do to her what is good in your sight. So Sarai treated her harshly, and she fled from her presence." You know, the lesson to be learned from this is things can go south very, very quickly. When you try to manufacture a solution or do something in your own power rather than doing things in the power of God or in God's will. Again, maybe they thought, because it's important again to note that in chapter 15, God did not reveal to Abraham who the mother would be. So he may have thought that he was doing in some measure the most reasonable thing, but this was not God's plan. They were trying to manufacture a solution on their own. And this happens all the time. I told you in our last lecture about how I, at one point in my life, tried to make a ministry decision on my own without really doing what I knew God wanted me to do, and that was to move to Nashville, Tennessee, instead of to Evansville, Indiana, when I went into evangelism. And it didn't go well because what I was doing was not unlike what they were doing here. What they were doing seemed sensible. What I was doing seemed sensible. What they were doing was going to get a solution. What I was doing was going to get a solution. The question is, was it God's solution? Was it what God ultimately wanted? And there are a lot of people who try to make a ministry really happen or make something work that is, and try to force it, and it's not what God wants. And those things, may seem to go well for a while. But ultimately, they end up not going well. Ultimately, they end up falling apart, or some immorality results, or something else. God makes it clear that He wasn't in it. And it's when we try to do things in our own power rather than to do things in the power of God. At this point in my ministry, and if this sounds braggadocious, I certainly don't mean for it to sound that way, but I'm experiencing a great deal of blessing. I'm the president of Trinity College of the Bible and Theological Seminary. I have journal articles in theological journals like at New Orleans Baptist Theological Seminary. I have a book published with several other very credible scholars called Anyone Can Be Saved that just recently came out. I have 6 or 7 other published books that are mine. That I've published. I've spoken in some incredible situations, been the president of the Conference of Southern Baptist Evangelists, had live public debates, and I've gotten a fair amount. I'm not a famous person, but I've gotten a fair amount of notoriety or credibility, I guess, in the eyes of people who are involved in ministry and academic theological endeavors. But I have to say, I haven't really done much by way of networking. And I've seen, when my father used to tell me this when I was going into ministry, he said, I think I could have, in the eyes of men, gone a lot farther than I've gone. But I never was the type to really network and to play the game, the political game that exists. And when I go to major conventions and major conferences, I see this sad sight that I recognized it for what it was and was repulsed by it at 20 years old when I first started going to these things. But I will see these guys who are, 22, 23, 24 years old and older, who have just come out of seminary and they've just started pastoring a church or being involved in some ministry, and they walk around the convention hall like spreading their feathers like a peacock, and they're so proud. And this is not a judgment I'm making about them without information. I mean, you talk with these people, and it's clear that this is what it is. And, they'll do things like they'll say, if you're a pastor, they'll say, how many are you running in Sunday school right now? Hey, how's your church doing? How many are you running in Sunday school? And you tell them, and the whole time you're telling them, they're looking around your head to see who else more important might be walking around behind you. And it's not uncommon that if they find someone who they think is a more valuable person for them to be conversing with, they'll walk away from you and go confront that person and talk to them. And if you tell them, well, I'm running, 150 in Sunday school or something, they don't care how many you're running in Sunday school. The only reason they've asked you is so that they can then tell you how many they're running in Sunday school and brag about it. I mean, trust me, I've seen this up close. I've been tempted to be a part of this sort of activity, and I've always reminded myself not to do that. But they're playing a political game. They're trying to get credit and value in the eyes of men, and they're forcing it to happen. There's nothing wrong with great websites. I'm proud of my website. There's not anything wrong with marketing on social media and things like that. There's nothing wrong with those sorts of things because people have to know that you exist. And if you have something valuable to say, I don't think it's wrong with anything wrong with saying it in a way that people can hear it. But what becomes problematic is when you're trying to force something and it's not clear whether God's doing it or you're doing it. I've seen that happen. That's a dangerous, dangerous thing. And where I'm at in my ministry right now, I can't say much for myself, but I will say this, and maybe I sound like one of those guys right now who's bragging about himself. But one thing I can say is I haven't tried to force anything. I have not really done much networking. I haven't done any politicking so far as I can tell. I hope that it is the case that the level of success, if there is any in my life right now, that God is doing that God has brought that about. And I don't really see a need to do a lot of bragging. And so when I'm around people, a lot of times they'll talk a lot about themselves, and I try to let them talk about themselves. This makes, in a certain sense, I understand. I sound like Paul in 2 Corinthians. I speak as a fool. I sound like I'm bragging about how much I don't brag right now. But what I'm trying to do is to impress upon you the importance of not being someone who tries to force a ministry or force a work or force success. God will bless it in His time. I've seen it in my own life. I've seen it in the lives of other people, and I've seen the catastrophe that can happen if it's attempted in some other way. Well, what we see in this story is three people, really two people, a third party was involved, who are trying to force something to happen, force a ministry to take place that God was not in. And when they try to do that, it causes a catastrophe, as we say. Now, the next thing we see here is that we come across this strange character, the angel of the Lord. It says in verse 7, "Now the angel of the Lord found her by a spring of water in the wilderness, by the spring on the way to Shur. He said, 'Hagar, Sarai's maid, where have you come from, and where are you going?' And she said, 'I am fleeing from the presence of my mistress Sarai.' Then the angel of the Lord said to her, 'Return to your mistress and submit yourself to her authority.' Moreover, the angel of the Lord said to her, 'I will greatly multiply your descendants, so that they will be too many to count.' The angel of the Lord said to her further, 'Behold, you are with child, and you will bear a son, and you shall call his name Ishmael, because the Lord has given heed to your affliction. He will be a wild donkey of a man. His hand will be against everyone, and everyone's hand will be against him, and he will live to the east of all his brothers.' Then she called the name of the Lord who spoke to her, 'You are a God who sees.' For she said, 'Have I even remained alive here after seeing him?' Therefore the well was called Ber Lahairoi, behold, it is between Kadesh and Bered. So Hagar bore Abram a son, and Abram called the name of his son, whom Hagar bore, Ishmael. Abram was 86 years old when Hagar bore Ishmael to him. Who is this strange character called the angel of the Lord? Now, you might not really think it needs to, that we need to comment too much about this, because you might say, well, it's obvious who that is. That's God. But this is no small matter, because we see this figure, the angel of the Lord, appearing with great regularity in Scripture. And the angel of the Lord is a debated issue among theologians. Some theologians, like I believe Ben Witherington would be an example, who says that the angel of the Lord is just a special messenger of God. He's not God himself, but he is a special messenger of God. Others say that it is God showing up. Still others say that it is God, but specifically it is Jesus, because when you have Jesus showing up when you have God showing up in the Old Testament, that is Jesus, because God functioning in some sort of a figure like that visibly on earth, that's Jesus. Well, let's talk about this for just a moment and try to come to some consideration. First of all, can we say that it is God? Well, we can say that Hagar certainly believed that it was God, because she said in verse 13, then she called the name of the Lord who spoke to her, you are a God who sees. She uses the name here, El Roy, because he is the God who sees. For she said, have I even remained alive after seeing him? So she is somewhat surprised that she saw God and lived. She certainly thought that it was God. You might say, well, but she could conceivably be wrong about that. As we said in one of the previous lectures, people in the Bible sometimes say things that aren't true. It's not that the Bible is untrue, but the Bible records the opinions and the words of men sometimes that aren't true. So just because she thinks it's God doesn't necessarily mean it's God, but it certainly seems to be speaking with the authority of God. Those who consider this to be a special angel that is speaking with the force of God or on behalf of God would say that that he speaks as though he is God because he's carrying all the weight of God as an angel representing or speaking on behalf of God. But that doesn't mean that he actually is God. Well, that is a possibility, I suppose, but let's look at this a little bit more deeply. The angel of the Lord, these words mean something. Literally translated, this would be the angel of Yahweh, the angel of the Tetragrammaton, the name for God, the angel of Yahweh. Yahweh was the name for God. So this is the angel of Yahweh. And this appears several times in Genesis and throughout the Bible. Genesis chapter 16, 17, 21, 22, 31, and 48. Also in Exodus chapter 3, 13, 14, and 23. In Judges 2, 6, 13, and in Zechariah 1 and 3. The word angel is the Hebrew word malak, M-A-L-A-K, as we spell it in English. And in Greek, it's the word angelos. That's where we get the word angel. But it doesn't necessarily refer to angels as we think of them. The word means messenger, and an angel is a messenger. So there is something that we call an angel that is a particular kind of being. But the word angel just means messenger. So when you read angel of the Lord, it could just as easily be read the messenger of Yahweh. Now, the messenger of Yahweh doesn't necessarily have to be an angel. That could be a poor translation. It could be that it should be translated the messenger of Yahweh. Now, you say, well, but if it's the messenger of Yahweh, that would mean that it isn't Yahweh. Well, the angel of the Lord does say things that only God could say, such as in Genesis chapter 16 and verse 10, moreover, the angel of the Lord said to her, I will greatly multiply your descendants, so that they will be too many to count. Well, who will? Well, obviously God will do that, but the angel of the Lord, the messenger of Yahweh, is saying that that's something that he is going to do. So how in the world can you have this messenger of Yahweh speaking as though he is Yahweh? In fact, we get a little more impression than that. In Zechariah has the angel speaking as the Lord and to the Lord. So this idea that it's just an earthly, messenger that's speaking with the impression or with the force of God. I guess that could make sense of this too, but what it says here in Zechariah chapter 3, verse 1, then he showed me Joshua, the high priest, standing before the angel of the Lord, and Satan standing at his right hand to accuse him. The Lord said to Satan, the Lord rebuke you, Satan. Indeed, the Lord who has chosen Jerusalem rebuke you. Is this not a brand plucked from the fire? So you have the angel of the Lord speaking. In other words, you have the messenger of Yahweh speaking as though he is God and speaking to God. So how can this be both someone speaking as though he is God and at the same time speaking to God? Well, you probably can already think of a couple of explanations here. One explanation is what I said already. Ben Witherington and others would say it is a special messenger who's speaking on behalf of God, and it's not God, but because he is speaking on behalf of God, he's able to speak with the voice of God as though he is God. That is an explanation that would make sense of it. Of course, it doesn't take the most plain reading of the text, which is to say that it is God, because we do have other places. For example, the angel of the Lord was the voice from the burning bush in Exodus chapter 3, and there says, I am the God of your father. The messenger of Yahweh, the angel of the Lord there certainly seems to be saying that he is God. Don't be unclear about this. When Jacob wrestles with the angel of, and there it says the angel of God, but when Jacob wrestles with the angel of God and the angel tells him, I am the God of Bethel. That's in Genesis chapter 31, verses 11 and 13. I am the God of Bethel. The angel of God identifies himself. The angel of Yahweh identifies himself. He says, I am God. I am the God of Bethel. I am the God of your father. Certainly seems like this angel of the Lord figure wants us to know that he is God. But then how could he be speaking as God and to God? That's what leads some to say, well, maybe he's just speaking with the voice of God, but isn't God. But there's a much cleaner explanation, isn't there? There is a much cleaner explanation that would handle all of this. And that is to say, wow, it seems like there's more than one person to the Godhead. That is to say, what would make this very clean is if the angel of the Lord, just as was the case with Melchizedek, we discussed a couple of lectures ago, if the angel of the Lord is actually a Christophany of Jesus. Because then the angel of the Lord, if he is Jesus, the messenger of Yahweh is Jesus, because isn't that exactly what Jesus is? He is the messenger of Yahweh. He is God's son. And if he is the angel of the Lord, then it makes it perfect sense for him to speak as though he is God, because he is, and then to speak to the Father as though he is God, because he is. I submit to you that that would make perfect sense of all of this. So you'll have to make up your own opinion about that, your own decision about that, but I've told you here what I think makes sense about that, okay? All right, so let's get back to Genesis chapter 16 now. So the angel of the Lord found her by the spring of water in the wilderness, by the spring on the way to Shur. Now, if it's on the way to Shur, here's what that means. That means she was on her way back to Egypt. So remember, she's an Egyptian, so she's on her way back to Egypt. She's going back home. I've had enough of this crazy family. I've had enough of this crazy wife. I'm going back to Egypt. I should have never left there to begin with. If I'd have had my way, I would have stayed. We can imagine her saying these things. Okay, it doesn't say that in Scripture, but we can imagine her saying things like that. Okay, so she's on her way to Shur, and it says in verse 8 that the angel of the Lord, the messenger of Yahweh, said to her, Hagar, Sarai's maid, where have you come from and where are you going? Now, it's telling that he says Sarai's maid. That is who he identifies her as. That is who she is. That is her role in life. Now, you might find this problematic because you say, well, but are you saying that the Bible is here advocating for slavery or for concubinism? Is the Bible here advocating that she belongs to Sarai as if one person can belong to another? Don't get carried away with 21st century ideas here. This speaks more to the cultural relationships at the time. And culturally, yes, she was a part of Abraham's house. She was Sarai's maid. That was her identity. And that's who she was. And so he's trying to impress upon her, you still have an obligation here. You don't get to make this choice. You have an authority over you, and that authority is Sarai. Where are you coming from? Where are you going? And she said, I am fleeing from the presence of my mistress Sarai. Then the messenger of Yahweh said to her, return to your mistress and submit yourself to her authority. Moreover, the angel of the Lord, the messenger of Yahweh, said to her, I will greatly multiply your descendants, so that they will be too many to count. The angel of the Lord said to her further, behold, you are with child, and you will bear a son, and you shall call his name Ishmael, because the Lord has given heed to your affliction. He will be a wild donkey of a man. His hand will be great against against everyone, and everyone's hand will be against him, and he will live to the east of all his brothers. So he's saying, listen, I'm aware of what's going on with you. This is not something that I've missed. I know what's going on. And listen, I'm going to do something great with Ishmael too. He likewise will have a great number of descendants. And of course, that is true. We know that Ishmael became the father of some of what we would call Arabs today. Now, there is a great debate that can be had about whether he is the father of all Arab nations. You know, when we get to when we further discuss his story later on, we will talk more about the implications this has for Islam and what Muslims want to say about Ishmael and all that went on there. Some Christians take it for granted that Ishmael was the father of all Arab peoples, and I understand that claim. However, that is almost an impossible claim to make because there has been so much intermarriage, and we have to get a historical context about what does it mean when we say the word Arab, what is that actually referring to, and all of that. I would just encourage you not to get carried away with this. What some people would like to say is that because what some Christians would like to say, and this is kind of turns into a sort of racism, that because Ishmael is the result of a union that God was not blessing, Hagar and Abraham, that means that these people, just by their very existence, represent something that was not a part of God's plan. You could then extrapolate from that God never intended for Ishmael to be born, and he never intended for any of the Arab peoples to be born. And if you connect the Arab peoples to all Arab peoples today in the 21st century, then you could easily make a bunch of claims that might sound good for preaching in certain places, such that all of this Islam and all that sort of thing never would have happened. You could trace it all back to Abraham and Hagar. However, understand something that is very important here, and that is that just because God was not involved, and I said this earlier, but just because God was not, I should say this way, just because it was not God's original desire for this union to take place, that doesn't mean it was not God's desire for the persons to become persons. That is, for Ishmael to be born and for others. You say, well, yeah, but how could that possibly be? How could they be born if this didn't happen? Well, I think it's just an assumption on people's part that God could not bring these persons about in some other way. I believe that God has a desire for every person's life, and I believe God is pleased with every person's life if they would serve him. And so God could bring about the person Ishmael quite apart from the biological and genetic attachment that comes from the relationship between Hagar and Ishmael. How that could happen seems strange to us because we attach a person so much to the biology that goes into that person. However, God could bring about these persons some other way, and a way that glorifies him. If you understand that, then you are not confined to the view that, for example, Jacob needed to marry and be polygamous with two different women and then these concubines in order to get the 12 people that would bring about the 12 tribes of Israel. God could have brought that about in some other way. Perhaps Jacob should have been satisfied to be with Leah. And if so, perhaps God could have miraculously brought about these 12 persons that would become the 12 tribes that way. I don't know. I'm just saying God can bring about persons some other way. And I think to discount an entire civilization or an entire group or people group based on this and say they should have never existed and God is not pleased with their very existence is going way beyond the text, because God could have brought about those persons in some other way. And here we see God making provision, God showing that he hears and he sees and he cares about Hagar and about Ishmael. And God has a plan for them as well. God was not surprised by this. He was not caught off guard by any of this. And he's going to greatly multiply Ishmael's descendants too, that they also will be too many to count. All right. It does say, though, that he is going to be a wild donkey of a man, that he's going to be somewhat of a nomad, that he's going to travel around, and that there's going to be, that people are going to be against him. He's going to be against them. Then she called the name of the Lord who spoke to her. You are a God who sees. You are a God who sees. That is El Roy. You are the God who sees. For she said, have I even remained alive here after seeing him? Therefore the well was called Bir Lahai Roy, or the well of him who sees, the God who sees. Behold, it is between Kadesh and Bered. So Hagar bore Abram a son, and Abram called the name of his son, whom Hagar bore Ishmael. This means that Hagar was a worshiper of the one true God too, because she clearly had the religion that Abram had, the faith that Abram had. So much so that Abram wasn't privy to this revelation of God to Hagar. She must have told him about this. And he didn't dispute it and say, no, we're not going to name the kid Ishmael just because you think that God spoke to you about this. No, he took it for granted that she was telling him the truth, and he went along with it and named the boy Ishmael. Abram was 86 years old when Hagar bore Ishmael to him. Now, so far as we know at this point, despite the negative things that happened with Sarai and Hagar and the relationship there, it certainly seems to be the case that Abram probably still thinks at this point that he's solved the problem. I mean, this didn't really go all that well in certain respects, but we've solved the problem now. We've got an heir. We've got someone who's going to be the child of promise. But as we're going to find out later, it wasn't the child of promise. This was a ministry that God was not involved in, as we said. So you can see again, as I said several lectures back, that there is this great drama that is being played out. God has said, I'm going to give you descendants, and all the world's going to be blessed through you. Nevertheless, there is this back and forth and this tension. What's going to happen? How is it going to come about? It looks like it's impossible, and it doesn't seem that way to us with eyes that have read these words so many times and heard preachers talk about them. But to fresh eyes, this is a real emotional roller coaster. And next time we'll pick it up and we'll carry the story forth.